The world didn't end, it simply stopped. No one noticed, nothing collapsed, nothing was replaced. And then, time stopped going anywhere. The world did not end in fire, it did not end in darkness. There were no alarms echoing through the cities, no final broadcasts, no moment when everyone looked up at the sky at the same time. The end of the world was not loud enough to be noticed. Instead, it happened the way evenings arrive, slowly, without permission. One moment blending into the next, until suddenly it was night. People continued waking up in the mornings. Trains still arrived, lights still turned on, children still went to school, and adults still felt tired for reasons they could not explain. Nothing was broken, nothing was missing, and yet something had finished. Not collapsed, not destroyed, completed. Long before anyone realized it, humanity had already lived through its final chapter. The last true beginning, the last irreversible change. After that, everything else was continuation. There was no single year historians would later circle in red, no date carved into stone, because the end did not happen all at once. It unfolded quietly across decades, across inventions that felt impressive but unnecessary, across discoveries that answered questions no one was asking anymore. At some point, humanity stopped chasing the unknown, not because it failed, but because it had already arrived somewhere it did not know how to leave. A place where everything worked well enough. Cities became strangely calm. They still grew, but only on paper. New buildings replaced old ones, but they were copies, not evolutions. Architecture stopped dreaming. Glass towers reflected the sky the same way they had for years. Roads expanded, but never felt new. Airports became larger, but not more meaningful. Everything optimized itself into stillness. People noticed it in small ways. Phones stopped feeling exciting. Updates arrived, but nothing changed. Movies were bigger, louder, more polished, and instantly forgettable. Music was endless, yet no song felt like it belonged to a generation. It was as if culture had reached a plateau and decided to camp there forever. Deep underground, servers hummed. They stored more human knowledge than any library in history, more memories than any mind could hold. And yet, nothing new was being added that mattered. Questions had answers, diseases had treatments, borders had agreements. There were still problems, yes, but none that threatened the story anymore. The plot had resolved. Only epilogues remained. Some philosophers sensed it first. They struggled to describe the feeling because language itself felt exhausted. They spoke of post-meaning, of civilizations that do not fall, but simply stop leaning forward. They were ignored because nothing felt wrong. Nature, however, noticed immediately. Forests crept back toward the edges of cities, not violently, not invasively, patiently. Vines wrapped around unused railways. Trees rooted themselves in cracks that would never be repaired. No one stopped them. There was no reason to. The world had time now. Somewhere along a quiet coastline, an old lighthouse continued operating. Its lights still rotated across the dark water, even though ships no longer relied on it. Navigation systems were flawless. Satellites watched everything. But no one turned the lighthouse off. Maintenance crews still visited once a year. They replaced bulbs. They repainted rusted railings. They could not explain why. It simply felt wrong to let it stop. This became the defining behavior of the after. Things were maintained, not because they were needed, but because letting go felt heavier than continuing. Machines were preserved long after their purpose faded. Institutions remained standing long after their ideals grew quiet. Nothing was allowed to end properly. People lived longer, not dramatically, not immortally, just long enough to notice the repetition. Lives extended without deepening, years accumulated without distinction, birthdays became quieter, milestones blurred together, even grief softened, because loss too became familiar. In museums, visitors walked through exhibits of human triumph, the first flight, the first satellite, the first steps on another world. Children stared politely. Teachers spoke with rehearsed awe, but no one felt the hunger those moments once carried. Exploration had become memory, not instinct. At night, cities glowed softly, not with celebration, not with urgency, with endurance. Windows lit up one by one, like a constellation that had learned to stay in place. People scrolled endlessly, not searching, not learning, passing time. Time, after all, was abundant now. Somewhere in a forgotten archive beneath a silent university, a document existed that no one read anymore. It was not classified. It was not hidden. It was simply irrelevant. The document did not predict the end of the world. It did not warn of disaster. It merely observed a pattern, a curve. Human progress, plotted across centuries, had not collapsed. It had flattened. And at the bottom of the page, someone had written a sentence no one ever quoted. Civilizations do not always die. Some of them finish. Outside, the wind moved through empty streets. Traffic lights changed colors for no one. Benches remained warm from the sun, untouched. The world was still alive, but it was no longer going anywhere, and no one remembered when that had become okay. Cities were never meant to last forever. They were built to answer questions, to solve problems, to gather people close enough that something new could happen. But when the questions ran out, the cities remained. They stood still, like sentences whose punctuation had been forgotten. In the after, cities no longer grew outward with ambition. They thickened inward with habit. Neighborhoods became self-contained worlds, cafes that never changed their menus, streets where the same footsteps passed every morning, at the same pace, with the same pauses. Urban planners still held meetings. They still presented models and projections. But every proposal felt strangely unnecessary. Why redesign a place that already worked? Why improve a system that no longer aimed anywhere? So plans were approved, then quietly postponed. Not cancelled, just delayed into irrelevance. Skylines froze, cranes stood like fossils against the sky, left in place long after construction finished. No one complained. They had become part of the view. Glass towers reflected sunsets they had seen 1,000 times before. Office floors remained occupied, but productivity became ceremonial. Work still happened. Emails were sent, reports were written, yet nothing moved forward. The work existed to justify the building existed to justify the city existed to justify staying. Public transport became the heartbeat of the after. Trains arrived perfectly on time. Stations were clean. Announcements were calm, almost gentle. But fewer people got off at destinations that mattered. They rode for the comfort of motion, not the promise of arrival. Some passengers stayed on for entire loops, watching tunnels pass like familiar dreams. Movement without direction felt safer than standing still. At the edges of the cities, nature continued its patient return. Not aggressively, not rebelliously. Grass grew between concrete tiles. Birds nested inside old signage. Foxes learned traffic patterns better than humans ever had. The city did not fight back. Maintenance budgets quietly shrank. Repairs were made only when something became dangerous. Beauty was no longer enforced. Decay, when slow enough, felt peaceful. Advertising changed. Billboards stopped shouting. They stopped promising transformation. Instead, they reassured. Reliable, trusted, still here. Products no longer promised a better life, only a familiar one. Brands competed over who could appear least disruptive. Nothing new wanted to disturb the after. Nightlife softened. Clubs closed earlier. Bars played quieter music. Conversations lingered longer, but went nowhere. People spoke about memories more than plans, about places they had already been, about versions of themselves that felt complete. Dreams shrank to fit reality, and reality never resisted. Universities remained open, lectures were still delivered, degrees were still awarded, but education became archival. Students learned what had been discovered, not what could be discovered. Research papers refined details. They corrected margins. They revisited conclusions. Breakthroughs became impossible, not because intelligence faded, but because curiosity lost its urgency. There was nothing left that needed saving. Somewhere in a quiet district, a library stayed open 24 hours a day. It was rarely full, but never empty. A few people wandered between shelves, touching spines without selecting anything. Reading felt like visiting old friends, comforting, predictable. The future sections collected dust no one noticed. In apartments stacked high above the streets, people watched the city breathe, lights turning on, lights turning off, patterns repeating. They felt safe. They felt bored. They felt guilty for feeling bored, because nothing was wrong. Occasionally someone would feel an unexplainable restlessness, not despair, not sadness, a pressure. They would take long walks at night, through districts that felt abandoned but maintained. They would stand beneath bridges, listening to the echo of water and traffic. And they would think, was this all meant to continue like this? The thought never stayed long. Morning routines dissolved it. The city's after meaning did not feel dead. They felt finished, like a story whose final chapter had been written so well that no sequel could justify itself. And so the pages stayed open. The world kept reading the same lines, again and again, comforted by their familiarity. Time was the first thing to lose its sharp edges. Not clocks, not calendars. Those still worked perfectly, but felt time, the kind that presses forward, that demands action, that whispers now or never. That kind of time quietly dissolved. In the after, mornings arrived without insistence. Alarms rang, but they were gentle. People woke up without panic, without anticipation. There was nowhere urgent to be. Schedules existed out of habit, not necessity. Meetings started on time, ended on time, and changed nothing. Deadlines were met because missing them no longer meant anything. The future had stopped threatening people. Children noticed it before adults could name it. They asked fewer "what will I be" questions. Instead they asked, will this always be here? Will it still look like this when I'm older? Teachers answered with comforting uncertainty. Probably. Most things stayed. Weeks blended together, not unpleasantly, not anxiously, like watercolors left too long in the rain. Holidays lost their contrast. Birthdays felt optional. Celebrations happened because they always had, not because something had been achieved. Technology tried to resist the flattening of time. Apps promised productivity. Watches tracked sleep, steps, heartbeats, graphs rose and fell. But the data had no consequence. Improvement for the sake of improvement felt strangely empty when there was nothing ahead that required it. People optimized themselves into stillness. News cycles slowed. There were still headlines, still debates, but no story felt historic. Nothing changed the direction of the world. Crises resolved themselves into management. Conflicts cooled into negotiations. The language of emergency faded. Everything became ongoing. Some historians attempted to identify the moment urgency died. They argued endlessly. Was it after the last major war? After the last global crisis that failed to reshape society? After the final technology that promised transformation and delivered convenience instead? There was no agreement, because urgency does not disappear in a moment. It erodes. Airports were still busy, planes still crossed the sky, but travel no longer felt like departure. Every place looked familiar. Every city shared the same rhythm, the same stores, the same architecture. Movement existed, but discovery did not. People returned home with photos that resembled the ones they already had. Time zones lost their mystery. Distance shrank. Waiting rooms became comfortable. Delays were accepted without frustration. What difference did an hour make when nothing depended on arrival? In offices, career ladders remained on the walls, but fewer people climbed them. Promotions felt symbolic. Titles changed. Salaries adjusted. Lives remained the same. Ambition softened into preference. People chose comfort over growth without feeling ashamed. A strange politeness spread. No one pushed too hard. No one demanded too much. The world had learned to avoid friction. Arguments ended early. Debates dissolved. Being right mattered less than staying calm. At night, time stretched. Hours passed without memory. People stayed awake longer, not because they were restless, but because sleep felt optional. Dreams repeated, not nightmares, not fantasies, familiar places, familiar conversations. The mind, like the world, revisited what it already knew. Some individuals tried to rebel against the softness of time. They set extreme goals. They chased physical limits. They sought danger. But even rebellion felt rehearsed. Risks were calculated. Safety nets existed everywhere. Nothing truly broke. Nothing truly ended. In hospitals, doctors noticed something unusual. Patients healed more slowly, not because medicine failed, but because bodies seemed unhurried. Recovery was patient. Death itself arrived calmly, without drama, without struggle, as if life had already finished its argument. Clocks continued ticking, seconds passed, years accumulated, but time no longer pointed anywhere. It surrounded people instead, like a lake without current. Somewhere, in an abandoned observatory on a quiet hill, a telescope remained pointed at the stars. It still tracked movement. Galaxies still drifted. Light still traveled. The universe had not slowed. Only humanity had. The observer had stopped leaning forward. Time without urgency did not feel like a curse. It felt like relief that lasted too long. People did not disappear when purpose faded. They adapted, quietly, instinctively, without mourning what was lost, because most never realized it had gone. Purpose had once been a force that pulled people forward. It shaped childhood dreams, defined adulthood struggles, and gave old age something to look back on. But in the after, purpose loosened its grip, not dramatically, not painfully. It simply stopped asking to be obeyed. Children still grew up hearing the same questions. What do you want to be? What do you love doing? What are you good at? But the answers carried less weight. A child could change their mind endlessly, without consequence. There was no rush to become anything. Becoming itself felt optional. Teenagers felt it first as a strange calm, no pressure to rebel, no need to escape. The world was already gentle. Risk had been reduced to simulations, failure cushioned by systems that never fully collapsed. Even disappointment arrived softly. Adolescence lost its sharp edges. Identity became flexible, but also shallow. Adults learned to live without long arcs. They still had jobs, relationships, responsibilities. But few of these things pointed toward a future self. Careers no longer told stories. People stayed where they landed, not trapped, just settled. Changing paths felt unnecessary when all paths led to the same place. Love changed, not into something colder, but something quieter. Romance still existed, desire still flickered, but love no longer felt like a promise of transformation. Couples stayed together because separation seemed like effort. They drifted apart, without conflict, without regret. Love became companionship without urgency. Marriage ceremonies grew simpler. Vows avoided words like forever. Instead, they spoke of for now, and no one found that sad. It felt honest. Friendships became seasonal. People entered each other's lives, without expectation of permanence. No one promised to stay, and so no one felt abandoned when connections faded. Memory replaced loyalty. Work became performance. Not in the sense of pretending, but in the sense of ritual. People showed up, they fulfilled roles, they completed tasks that sustained systems, that sustained stability. Work did not define worth. It filled time. Ambition did not vanish. It miniaturized. People wanted small improvements, better lighting, quieter spaces, more comfortable routines. Grand visions felt embarrassing. Wanting too much felt impolite. Mental health shifted. Anxiety declined. Depression softened. But something else appeared in their place. A flatness, not despair, absence. Therapists struggled to name it. Patients said, "I'm fine, I just don't care much." There was nothing to treat. Nothing was wrong. Spirituality drifted. Old religions remained, but their urgency faded. Prayers became reflections. Rituals became mindfulness. People no longer asked for salvation. They asked for calm. Some individuals resisted the after internally. They felt a private ache, a sense that something essential had been misplaced. They could not name it. They tried art. They tried solitude. They tried excess. Nothing broke the stillness. The world absorbed everything. A few people withdrew completely. They moved to quiet outskirts, small coastal towns, mountain edges. They lived simply, not as protest, as intuition. They felt closer to something there, though they could not say what. Elderly people noticed something unsettling. They no longer felt like carriers of wisdom. The young did not need guidance. Mistakes were no longer fatal. Experience had lost its leverage. A lifetime of lessons had nowhere to land. Death changed people most of all. It lost its narrative power. There were no unfinished destinies, no interrupted arcs. Lives felt complete, long before they ended. People died peacefully, having already said everything they needed to say, not because they had lived fully, but because nothing demanded more from them. People after purpose were not empty, they were light, so light that they barely pressed into the world. They passed through days gently, leaving few marks, disturbing little. Humanity became quiet enough to hear itself breathing, and for the first time in history, no one was asking, what comes next? Nature had always been waiting, not in anger, not in revenge, in patience. Long before cities rose, long before language learned to describe itself, nature had mastered stillness. And when humanity finally stopped leaning forward, nature stepped in, not forcefully, but confidently. The transition was so subtle that no one announced it. No laws were passed, no declarations made. Nature did not conquer, it simply resumed. At first it appeared as neglect, a park left unmowed a little longer than usual, a roadside bush allowed to grow wider, a riverbank repair postponed indefinitely. No one objected. Budgets were tight, but nothing urgent was breaking. Then patterns began to change. Animals returned to places they had never truly forgotten. Deer crossed highways at dawn, timed perfectly between sparse traffic. Birds nested on balconies, unafraid of glass and steel. Insects rebalanced ecosystems that had been artificial for generations. The city accepted them, like background noise turning into music. Forests reclaimed edges first, suburbs softened, fences rotted, lawns became fields. Trees grew tall enough to shade rooftops. Homeowners noticed, but did not intervene. Property values stabilized anyway. Nothing needed protecting anymore. Rivers remembered their paths. Concrete channels cracked. Water slipped through patiently, finding older routes. Floods were gentler, wider, more forgiving. Engineers watched quietly. The river was doing a better job. Weather became less dramatic, not calmer, just more honest. Storms arrived when needed. Rain lingered longer. There was no pressure to optimize the sky. Climate systems, long strained by urgency, relaxed. Nature thrived on time humanity no longer demanded. Agriculture changed completely. Farms stopped chasing maximum yield. Fields diversified themselves. Wild plants returned among crops, balancing soil without instruction. Harvests became smaller, but stable. No one worried. There was enough. Food tasted different, less engineered, less intense. People adjusted. Flavor no longer needed to impress. It only needed to sustain. Cities adapted without debate. Green roofs spread, not as innovation, as surrender. Walls were left unfinished, so vines could choose their own routes. Urban planning became permission, not control. Animals learned the rhythms of the after faster than humans ever could. They followed quiet. They avoided noise. With fewer interruptions, migration patterns stabilized. Extinction slowed. Not because humanity saved nature, but because humanity stopped demanding from it. Oceans responded last. They took time. Currents shifted gradually. Coral recovered in unexpected pockets. Fishing declined not by policy, but by disinterest. The sea breathed easier. There were no celebrations, no headlines. Nature did not ask for applause. It simply filled the space that had been vacated. Some humans felt uneasy. They sensed leadership changing hands. For millennia, humanity had framed itself as the narrator of the planet. Now it felt like a side character. Observers, caretakers at most. Environmentalists struggled. Their movement had lost its enemy. There was nothing left to fight. Protection turned into observation. Activism turned into quiet documentation. Technology adjusted its posture. Monitoring systems remained, but intervention decreased. Sensors watched forests grow, satellites tracked rivers wander, data was collected without plans to change outcomes. For the first time, information existed without intent. A new kind of silence emerged, not absence of sound, but absence of resistance. Wind moved through cities unchallenged. Rain lingered on surfaces designed to reject it. Rust appeared and was allowed to stay. Decay became a collaborator. People spent more time outdoors, not adventuring, just existing, sitting beneath trees that had no plaques, walking paths that were never finished. Nature stopped being a destination. It became context. Children learned plants before machines. They recognized bird calls instinctively. Not as survival skill, as familiarity. They grew up fluent in stillness. Some philosophers proposed a quiet theory that humanity's greatest innovation was learning when to stop. Not as surrender, as maturity. Nature did not erase humanity. It reshaped it. Cities became ecosystems. Humans became a species among many, equal in fragility, equal in presence. And the planet, long strained by ambition, finally moved at its own pace again, not faster, not slower. True. For most of human history, memory was a form of survival. To remember was to protect. To record was to resist disappearance. To leave something behind meant that existence had mattered. Civilizations carved stone. They raised monuments. They wrote names into walls and books and skies. They feared forgetting more than death. But in the after, memory changed its purpose. It no longer needed to fight time. Time was no longer an enemy. At first, archives expanded. Digital storage grew endlessly. Every image saved, every voice preserved, every moment logged somewhere redundantly, endlessly. Humanity had finally achieved perfect recall. And then, it stopped caring. People no longer felt the urgency to document their lives. Photos were taken, but rarely revisited. Videos were recorded, but seldom replayed. Memories existed, but they did not demand attention. The act of remembering lost its emotional weight. Social platforms softened. Posts no longer reached for permanence. There was no need to be remembered by strangers. Validation faded. People shared quietly, knowing nothing would disappear, and therefore nothing needed defending. History classes changed tone. They were no longer framed as warnings or triumphs. They became descriptions. Students learned about wars with the same calm they learned about weather patterns. Events were placed in context, not moralized. The past was complete. It did not ask to be corrected. Monuments aged naturally. No one restored them aggressively. Stone cracked, metal rusted, plaques faded until names blurred together. Visitors walked past without sadness. They understood instinctively. The monument had already done its work. Artists struggled with legacy. For centuries, art had been a reach into the future, a demand to be seen long after the creator was gone. But in the after, the future felt uninterested. Art became temporary by choice. Murals were painted knowing they would peel. Music was composed without expectation of replay. Creation became an act, not a statement. Libraries remained, but their purpose softened. They were no longer vaults against loss. They became sanctuaries of quiet. People wandered shelves without seeking meaning. Reading became companionship with the past, not instruction. Names lost their hunger. Families stopped tracing lineage obsessively. Ancestry mattered less when inheritance carried no power. People honored relatives privately. There was no need to be remembered publicly. Even death certificates changed language. They listed fewer achievements, no titles, no summaries, just dates, and sometimes a favorite place. Memory without legacy did not feel empty. It felt light. The pressure to matter dissolved. People lived more gently when they no longer needed to justify their existence to the future. Some elders found this unsettling. They had lived with the belief that memory was duty, that forgetting was failure. They worried humanity was disappearing, but disappearance required absence. Humanity was still here. It had simply stopped shouting its name into time. Cemeteries grew quieter, graves were smaller, markers simpler, flowers returned to soil without replacement. Grief remained, but it did not cling. Mourning shortened, not from lack of love, but from acceptance. Stories stopped demanding endings. Narratives drifted. Lives did not need resolution. People understood something instinctively. Nothing was being lost. In the absence of legacy, presence deepened. Moments mattered because they were happening, not because they would be remembered. A conversation did not need to echo forever, to be enough. Humanity finally realized something ancient, something nature had always known. Nothing needs to last, to be real. And so memory remained, vast, complete, untouched, while legacy quietly stepped aside. There was a time when every human life revolved around a single question. It was asked differently in every era, spoken in countless languages, whispered in temples, laboratories, bedrooms, and battlefields. But it was always the same question. Why? Why are we here? Why does this matter? Why should this continue? Why should I move forward? Civilizations rose on variations of that question. Wars were fought because of it. Faiths were born from it. Science existed to challenge it. The question gave motion to everything, and then, quietly, humanity stopped asking it. No council voted to remove it. No ideology declared it obsolete. It simply lost its urgency. At first, the question softened. Why became how? How do we make this easier? How do we reduce discomfort? How do we maintain balance? Purpose was replaced by process. People no longer ask why systems existed, only how to keep them stable. And stability was achievable. Children still asked why, but their questions were smaller. Why is the sky blue? Why do leaves fall? Why do people work? They rarely asked, why do we live like this? Why should things be different? Their world felt complete. Philosophy departments noticed enrollment dropping, not dramatically, just steadily. Students didn't reject philosophy. They simply didn't feel the need for it. Existential tension had dissolved. The questions philosophy answered no longer caused discomfort. Religion adapted quietly. Sermons shifted tone, less promise, less warning. Faith became atmosphere rather than direction. People attended services for stillness, not salvation. The idea of an ultimate answer felt unnecessary. Science reached a strange maturity, not a final theory, but a final posture. Research continued, but curiosity lost its desperation. There was no race, no looming unknown threatening existence. Science stopped trying to explain meaning, it described patterns, and left them there. Politics became administrative. Ideologies blurred. The question of what kind of future was replaced by how to maintain the present. People voted calmly. Protests softened. Revolutions became impossible. There was nothing unbearable enough to overthrow. Art sensed the change deeply. Artists had always asked why, through form, sound, and silence. Now art began to linger instead of question. Installations existed without statements. Music unfolded without climax. Art no longer demanded interpretation, it offered presence. Language itself adjusted. Grand narratives disappeared. Sentences shortened. Metaphors softened. People spoke clearly, directly, without hidden hunger. Poetry became observation. The last people to notice the loss of why were the ones who still felt it. They were not many. They felt a subtle ache, not pain, not grief, a sense that something essential was no longer being named. They searched for the question in books, in conversations, in the sky. But the world did not echo it. One of them stood one night on a quiet hill, watching a city breathe below, lights blinking, trains passing, lives continuing. Everything worked, everything endured. And yet, the question rose again, why does any of this exist at all? The question felt out of place, like speaking an old language to a world that no longer needed it. They did not find an answer, but more importantly, they realized no one else was looking for one, and that realization changed the question itself. Why had once been a tool of survival, a pressure that pushed humanity through fear, through ignorance, through limitation. But survival was no longer under threat. Meaning had been replaced by sufficiency. The world did not feel empty without why. It felt smooth, like a river that no longer questioned its direction. In the absence of the question, people became kinder, less judgmental. If nothing ultimately meant more than anything else, then cruelty felt pointless. Competition faded. Comparison softened. Life became something to inhabit, not justify. People woke up, moved through their days, rested, no destiny, no calling, just existence unfolding gently. The question did not vanish completely. It slept, deep within the species, dormant, waiting for a time when discomfort would return, when stillness would crack. But in the after, there was no such time, only continuation. Humanity had not answered the ultimate question. It had outgrown the need to ask it. And that, more than any collapse or catastrophe, was the true ending of the world. For most of history, humanity believed itself to be the center of the story. Even when people disagreed about gods, about purpose, about truth, they agreed on one thing. Whatever this world was, it was about us. The planet was a stage, nature was a resource, time was a challenge. Humanity stood in the spotlight, and then, without ceremony, the light moved on. The change did not feel like humiliation. No one was pushed aside. Humanity simply stopped insisting. At first, people still spoke as if they were in control. We manage the environment, we guide development, we shape the future. But the words rang hollow. Systems ran themselves. Ecosystems stabilized without instruction. Technologies maintained equilibrium better than ambition ever had. Humans were present, but no longer central. In documentaries, narration changed tone. Earlier generations spoke of conquest. Now, voices spoke of coexistence, not as ideology, as observation. Cities no longer felt like achievements. They felt like habitats. Structures blended into terrain. Noise softened. Human presence became one layer among many. In forests, paths grew faint. Humans walked them less often. Animals crossed freely. No territory felt owned. The land did not respond differently, whether humans passed through or not. And that realization stayed with people. Children grew up without the idea of dominance. They did not see the world as something to master. They saw it as something already complete. Humans were participants, not protagonists. Space exploration quietly ended, not from failure, not from danger, from disinterest. There was nothing humanity needed to escape, nothing it needed to claim. The stars remained distant, beautiful, indifferent, and that was acceptable. In media, stories changed perspective. Narratives followed places instead of people, a river across centuries, a forest across seasons, a city across silence. Humans appeared briefly, like passing weather. Some felt unsettled. They had grown up believing humanity mattered most. They feared insignificance. But insignificance never arrived, only proportion. The planet did not reject humanity. It absorbed it, like it absorbed everything else. Humans learned a new posture, to exist without narrating themselves, to move without framing meaning, to live without claiming ownership of time. And slowly, humanity became background, not erased, not diminished, just no longer demanding focus. For thousands of years, achievement had been humanity's language. To achieve was to prove existence. To accomplish was to justify time. Lives were measured in milestones, societies in progress, civilizations in monuments. Achievement gave shape to effort. It turned motion into meaning. And then, quietly, achievement fell silent. At first, the world continued celebrating. Awards were still given. Ceremonies were still held. Applause echoed through halls built for recognition. But something had shifted. The applause felt polite, brief, weightless. Achievements no longer changed the direction of anything. People still completed great tasks. Bridges were built flawlessly. Systems ran with unprecedented efficiency. Diseases were managed, contained, softened. But when something was achieved, nothing followed. No new horizon opened. No next challenge demanded itself. Accomplishment ended where it began. In earlier ages, finishing something meant standing at the edge of something else. A discovery led to exploration. A victory led to expansion. A breakthrough demanded another. But now, completion folded inward. The world absorbed success without reaction. Individuals noticed it first in small ways. A promotion felt identical to the day before. A degree changed nothing about how life felt. A finished project disappeared into a system that did not need to acknowledge it. People asked themselves, "Why did I want this so badly?" and found no answer waiting on the other side. Athletes continued training. Records were broken. Limits were reached. but numbers lost their power. A faster time did not rewrite history. A higher score did not inspire generations. Excellence became private, impressive, but quiet. In science, breakthroughs arrived without ceremony. A cure was refined, a model perfected, a process stabilized. There was no global gasp. The world nodded and moved on unchanged. The miracle was expected. In earlier centuries, achievement created heroes, figures whose names echoed forward in time. But now, heroes faded instantly. No one needed saving. No disaster demanded singular brilliance. Collective stability replaced individual triumph. The age of the exceptional ended without resistance. Children grew up without role models, not because they lacked inspiration, but because inspiration felt unnecessary. They did not dream of becoming legends. They dreamed of becoming comfortable. Content, education adjusted slowly, grading softened, competition eased. Students learned deeply, but without pressure. Success did not elevate them above others. It simply ended the task. Even failure changed. It lost its sting. Failure no longer threatened survival, status, or future. Mistakes were absorbed by systems designed to cushion everything. Nothing fell far enough to break. Workplaces became calm. Deadlines existed, but were flexible. Effort was acknowledged, but not celebrated. The phrase "great job" lost its spark, not from ingratitude, but from repetition. In earlier times, achievement created identity. I am what I have done. Now, people struggle to define themselves that way. They were not their accomplishments. They were simply present. Museums displayed achievements like fossils. Visitors walked through halls of invention, innovation, victory. They admired craftsmanship. They felt no urgency to add themselves to the display. The story felt complete. Some people mourned the silence. They missed striving. They missed wanting something hard enough to suffer for it. They tried to recreate hunger, extreme challenges, artificial scarcity, manufactured competition, but it never lasted. The world was too stable to hold tension. Others felt relief, no more pressure to matter, no fear of falling behind. Life no longer felt like a race. It felt like a landscape. Achievement did not disappear. It dissolved into background function. Things worked. Things improved incrementally, but nothing stood out. And slowly humanity realized something unsettling. Achievement had never been the point. It had only been a way to move forward when forward mattered. Now that direction was gone. Achievement had nowhere to point. The silence that followed was not empty. It was wide, a quiet plain where effort could rest. People learned to live without trophies, without milestones, without the constant need to prove they deserved to exist. And for the first time in its history, humanity stopped asking, "What have we accomplished?" Because the answer no longer changed anything. For most of human history, heroes were necessary, not because they were rare, but because the world was unstable. Heroes appeared where systems failed. They rose where fear concentrated. They existed to carry weight that no one else could. A hero was proof that chaos could be resisted by a single will. And for a long time, humanity needed that proof. Heroes wore many faces: warriors, leaders, explorers, inventors, martyrs. Some were real, some were constructed, some were remembered incorrectly, but all of them served the same function. They gave the story a center. In the after, that center dissolved, not violently, not defiantly, gently. At first, the world still looked for heroes. When problems appeared, people waited. They expected someone to rise above the rest, someone to speak louder, someone to act faster. But the problems did not grow large enough to require it. Systems adjusted themselves, networks compensated, collective responses replaced individual brilliance. The moment passed without a name attached to it. Media tried to preserve hero narratives. Profiles were written, faces were framed, stories were told, but they failed to hold attention. A hero who saves nothing cannot stay heroic for long. Crises became procedural, disasters were managed calmly, failures were absorbed quietly, no singular figure stood at the center. Responsibility spread evenly until it became invisible. In earlier centuries, heroes were aspirational. Children wanted to become them. They imagined standing apart from the crowd, changing the course of events. But children in the after imagined something else. They imagined belonging, not standing out, not being remembered, just fitting into a world that did not require salvation. Leadership changed shape. Leaders still existed, but they were interchangeable. No charisma, no myth. They facilitated rather than commanded. Guidance replaced vision. Administration replaced destiny. Even rebellion lost its heroes. There was nothing dramatic enough to oppose. No tyrant. No collapsing order. Protest became dialogue. Dialogue became maintenance. Revolution became impossible, because nothing was unbearable. In fiction, heroes faded first. Stories no longer followed chosen ones. They followed environments, communities, moments. When a character acted bravely, it felt ordinary. Courage lost its spotlight. Some people mourned the disappearance of heroes. They felt the world had lost inspiration. Without exceptional figures, life felt flat. They missed being moved by sacrifice, by impossible odds, by singular defiance. But the world did not respond to that nostalgia. It had already adjusted. Others felt relief. No pressure to be extraordinary. No expectation to rise above. Failure did not brand you as weak. Success did not isolate you. Equality became emotional, not ideological. Even villains disappeared. Without heroes, there were no antagonists worthy of myth. Conflict shrank to scale, misunderstandings, errors, misalignments. Nothing demanded a nemesis. History books changed tone. Earlier chapters celebrated individuals. Later chapters described systems. Names gave way to processes. Timelines flattened. Statues stopped being built. Old ones remained, but new ones felt inappropriate. Who would they depict? No one stood far enough above the rest to justify permanence. Some elders tried to tell stories of heroes. They spoke of courage, of sacrifice, of decisive moments. Listeners appreciated the stories, as one appreciates storms after the weather has stabilized. Impressive, but distant. Humanity did not become weaker without heroes. It became distributed. Strength spread evenly. Responsibility no longer waited for permission. The idea of being the one vanished. No chosen individuals, no destined saviors, only people existing together, without hierarchy of meaning. And slowly, the world learned something unexpected. Heroes had never saved humanity. Humanity had always saved itself by imagining them. Now that imagination rested, the absence of heroes did not feel like emptiness. It felt like balance. No one stood above the world anymore. No one needed to. For most of its existence, history moved like a wheel. It turned. Slowly at first, then faster, then violently. Empires rose, collapsed, rose again under different names. Every generation believed it lived at the edge of a turning point. They were almost always wrong, but the belief itself kept the wheel moving. History depended on contrast. Before and after, golden ages and dark ages, progress and decline. Without contrast, time lost its drama. In the after, the wheel did not break, it simply stopped turning, and no one noticed at first. Calendars continued. Years were counted, dates were recorded, but nothing marked them. No era announced itself, no chapter demanded a title. Earlier historians divided time aggressively: ancient, medieval, modern, postmodern. Each label implied motion. Each suggested that humanity was going somewhere. But eventually, new labels stopped appearing, not because historians failed, but because nothing justified distinction. Technology stabilized, not frozen, not forbidden. Just complete enough. Every improvement became marginal, every update imperceptible. The difference between one decade and the next required explanation. Culture flattened. Music did not evolve. It circulated. Styles returned unchanged, not revived, not reinterpreted, just reused. Originality lost urgency. Fashion stopped embarrassing itself. Clothes no longer defined generations. They became comfortable solutions rather than statements. Architecture reached equilibrium. Buildings were neither ambitious nor temporary. They blended with environment, with climate, with usage. Nothing demanded to be remembered. Politics entered permanent maintenance mode. No revolutions, no ideological earthquakes. Adjustments replaced transformations. Debates became technical. Language lost fire. Even language itself slowed. New words appeared less often. Old words stopped dying. Meaning stabilized. Ambiguity softened. People still spoke about the past, but they spoke about it evenly. No century felt distant. No moment felt sacred. The emotional weight of history dissolved. Museums changed purpose. They no longer educated. They preserved continuity. Walking through one felt like walking through a long hallway where nothing ended and nothing began. Anniversaries became strange. Why celebrate 100 years when the 100 before it felt identical? Commemoration faded. Children learned history differently, not as a sequence of events, but as a texture, a description of how things had always felt. Teachers stopped asking, "Why did this change everything?" Instead, they asked, "How did this continue?" The idea of a turning point became mythical. People understood the phrase, but struggled to imagine it emotionally, like trying to picture gravity turning off. Prophecies stopped being written. Predictions felt pointless. The future no longer promised difference. It promised extension. Some feared stagnation. They searched desperately for evidence of decay. But decay requires imbalance, and the system absorbed it. Others found comfort. No looming collapse, no forced acceleration. Life became wide instead of forward. Art reflected this shift. No climaxes, no conclusions, just presence. Paintings that didn't demand interpretation, music that didn't resolve, stories that ended where they began. Time itself felt softer. Days were not rushed. Years did not threaten. A lifetime felt complete, without needing a peak. People stopped asking, "Where is this all going?" because the question no longer made sense. History had always been humanity's way of pretending movement was necessary. When survival stabilized, that illusion relaxed. The wheel did not need to turn anymore. Humanity was not going anywhere. And for the first time, that felt acceptable. Not triumphant, not tragic. Just, for thousands of years, innovation was urgency. It was hunger made intelligent, fear translated into tools, limitation transformed into motion. Humanity invented because it had to. Every new idea was a response to pressure. Cold demanded shelter, distance demanded wheels, ignorance demanded symbols. Innovation was never curiosity first. It was survival wearing imagination. Then, slowly, pressure thinned, not evenly, not suddenly, but enough. At first, innovation continued out of habit. People improved things because improvement was expected. Devices became smaller, faster, more efficient, but the gains felt abstract. The difference between before and after no longer touched daily life. A new invention no longer changed how people lived. It changed how systems reported themselves. Benchmarks improved. Charts shifted upward. But human experience remained identical. This was the first warning, and it was ignored. Research institutions expanded, budgets grew, labs hummed quietly with activity, but the questions being asked felt circular: how to optimize, not how to transform. Engineers began to notice something unsettling. Every new solution solved a problem that no one felt emotionally. The invention worked, but nothing inside the human body responded to it. No relief, no excitement, just acknowledgement. Innovation lost its audience. Earlier generations gathered around breakthroughs. They watched demonstrations. They imagined futures. They felt awe. But awe requires contrast, and contrast had faded. The most advanced tools became invisible, not hidden, integrated. They dissolved into background existence. People stopped noticing what enabled their lives. Innovation reached a strange threshold. Everything essential had been solved. Everything remaining was optional. Optional things do not demand urgency. They wait, sometimes forever. Inventors struggled psychologically. They were trained to chase breakthroughs, but breakthroughs had nowhere to land, no emotional impact, no societal shift. Some tried to force disruption. They exaggerated risks, invented urgency. But the world didn't panic anymore. Fear had lost leverage. Markets responded predictably. Speculation flattened. Hype cycles shortened. A new product appeared, circulated briefly, then blended into the existing fabric. No revolutions, only absorption. Even medicine reached equilibrium. Life was long enough. Health was stable enough. Extending it further felt theoretical. People accepted limits calmly. The dream of immortality dissolved quietly, not rejected, just deprioritized. Education systems noticed the shift next. Students still learned engineering, science, design. But fewer asked, what will this change? They asked, how will this fit? Innovation became maintenance, keeping systems aligned, preventing drift, ensuring balance. The word breakthrough began to sound archaic. It implied resistance. But nothing resisted anymore. Some philosophers tried to revive innovation philosophically. They argued humanity needed challenge. That stagnation would erode meaning, but meaning had already restructured itself. It no longer relied on progress. Art mirrored the silence. Artists stopped glorifying invention. They depicted stillness, objects at rest. technologies asleep. Museums of science became quiet places. No excitement, no spectacle, just long halls of solved problems. Children walked through them politely. They did not dream of becoming inventors. They dreamed of understanding how things already worked. The final inventions were almost ceremonial, elegant, precise, unnecessary. They closed loops. They completed systems. After that, nothing followed. No announcement, no declaration, just absence. People continued living, eating, sleeping, working. The world functioned flawlessly, and no one felt the urge to improve it. Innovation had reached its final form. Silence, not failure, not exhaustion, completion. The greatest invention humanity ever achieved was realizing it no longer needed to invent, and in that realization, time loosened its grip. Speed was never natural to humanity. It was learned, it was trained, it was enforced. Early humans moved at the pace of their bodies. They walked, they waited, they observed. Time was not something they chased, it was something they occupied. Speed entered the world with fear. Fear of scarcity, fear of loss, fear of being left behind. When survival became competitive, movement accelerated. Faster tools, faster communication, faster decisions. Speed became synonymous with intelligence. The quick mind was praised, the slow one was corrected. Civilizations measured themselves by how fast they could move matter, information, and people. For centuries, speed felt like progress. Shorter distances, instant messages, rapid responses. Waiting became intolerable. Stillness felt inefficient. But in the after, something subtle shifted. Speed stopped delivering emotional value. The difference between instant and immediate became meaningless. A message arriving in 1 second felt identical to one arriving in 10. People noticed they were not happier moving faster. They were simply more exhausted. Systems continued accelerating out of inertia, but individuals quietly disengaged. The first signs appeared in language. People stopped saying hurry, not consciously. The word just appeared less often. Deadlines softened, not removed, just de-emphasized. Transportation slowed, not because it had to, because no one minded. Arriving earlier did not improve experience. Even entertainment decelerated. Scenes lingered longer. Music stretched. Silence became acceptable. Workflows expanded in time. Efficiency metrics lost prestige. Accuracy and calm replaced speed. Children adapted instantly. They had never believed speed was natural. They learned slowly, deeply, without urgency. Education stopped rewarding quick answers. It rewarded considered ones. Pauses were allowed. Thinking became visible. Digital spaces changed texture. Feeds stopped refreshing endlessly. Information waited patiently. Nothing demanded immediate attention. Notifications grew rare, eventually unnecessary. People rediscovered boredom, not as discomfort, as spaciousness. Without speed, competition weakened. Races require motion towards scarcity. Scarcity had faded. Markets slowed. Trends lasted years, not hours. Fashion seasons dissolved. Style became stable. Even emergencies felt different. They were handled steadily, without adrenaline. Medical responses prioritized precision over haste. Lives were saved without drama. Adrenaline became unfamiliar. Some remembered it fondly, others felt relieved. Sports transformed. Records stopped falling. Games became ritualistic. Movement mattered more than outcome. Without speed, time expanded. Days felt longer without being heavier. People slept more, dreamed deeper. Walking replaced rushing. Waiting replaced reacting. The idea of falling behind lost meaning. Behind what? Ahead of whom? Speed had always been borrowed urgency. When survival stabilized, its purpose vanished. Humanity did not decide to slow down, it simply forgot why it was rushing. And once forgotten, speed could not justify itself. The world became quiet. Not silent, just unhurried. Moments stretched. Lives widened. No one missed the rush, because no one remembered what it was rushing toward. Ambition once defined the shape of a human life. It was the line that pointed forward, the invisible arrow inside the chest. People asked children what they wanted to be, not who they wanted to understand, not how they wanted to feel, but what position they aimed to occupy in the future. Ambition turned time into a ladder, and everyone was expected to climb. Ambition was praised as virtue. Those who had it were called driven. Those who lacked it were called lost. Rest was suspicious. Contentment was temporary. To stop wanting more was to fail quietly. But in the after, ambition lost its footing. Not because people were discouraged, but because the ladder dissolved. There was nowhere clearly higher to go. No dramatic difference between lives. No summit worth exhaustion. At first, ambition persisted out of reflex. People set goals because they had always set goals. But the goals felt artificial. They did not pull the body forward. They did not tighten the chest. They existed only on paper. Success stopped changing lives. Promotion did not alter meaning. Achievement did not reshape identity. Winning felt polite. Failure softened too. To fail was not to fall behind. It was to remain where you already were. The language around ambition changed. People stopped asking, "What are you working toward?" They asked, "What are you working with?" Careers flattened, not abolished, stabilized. Roles rotated gently. No one raced upward. No one was pushed down. The idea of making it disappeared. There was nothing to make, nothing to arrive at. People began to notice something unsettling. Without ambition, life did not collapse, it widened. Time returned to the present. Moments stopped being stepping stones. They became locations, places to stay. Children were no longer taught to dream big. They were taught to notice, to listen, to sense when something felt enough. Education stopped framing the future as conquest. It framed it as continuity. Ambition had always been fueled by comparison, but comparison required distance. And distance had narrowed. Without ambition, envy faded. Jealousy lost its sharpness. No one seemed ahead. No one seemed behind. Some mourned ambition deeply. They felt something essential had been lost. Without striving, what gave life tension? What created narrative? But others discovered a quieter structure. Life did not need climax. It needed rhythm. Daily routines gained dignity. Not as means, but as ends. Work became an act of care, not a ladder rung. Art reflected this shift. No stories of rise and fall, no arcs of triumph, just presence. Characters did not transform. They remained. Even language lost ambition. Verbs become, achieve, conquer. They faded from frequency. In their place came gentler words, tend, maintain, share. Ambition had once promised transcendence, but transcendence required dissatisfaction, and dissatisfaction had grown unnecessary. People stopped asking, "What else could I be?" They asked, "What is already here?" Lives felt smaller from the outside, but from within, They felt complete. The future stopped pulling. The present stopped resisting. Ambition did not die. It dissolved into something quieter. Care, not the care that fixes, the care that stays. And in a world without ambition, no one felt left behind because no one was running anymore. Competition was once described as natural, as if it emerged from the soil, as if it were written into muscle and bone. But competition was never natural. It was contextual. It appeared when resources felt limited, when survival depended on comparison, when one person's gain implied another's loss. Competition was fear-given structure. For a long time, it worked. It drove efficiency, sharpened skill, accelerated outcomes. Societies organized themselves around it. Schools ranked, markets competed, nations compared. Winning became identity, losing became shame. But in the after, competition lost its terrain, not because rules changed, but because stakes dissolved. When basic needs stabilized, winning stopped mattering. You could still win. It just didn't do anything. The first institutions to feel this were schools. Grades still existed, but they didn't open doors anymore. Doors were already open. Students noticed. They studied differently, not to outperform, to understand. Tests became diagnostic, not judgmental. Sports changed next. Games continued, but records stopped being worshipped. A new record felt like a statistic, not a victory. Crowds still gathered, but they watched differently, not waiting for dominance, enjoying motion. Athletes played longer, not to peak, to remain. Markets followed. Companies competed less aggressively. Innovation no longer promised conquest. Market share stopped feeling heroic. Advertising softened. It stopped shouting. There was no one to defeat. Workplaces lost internal rivalry. Performance reviews became conversations. Collaboration replaced ranking. People noticed their bodies responding. Less tension, less comparison-driven anxiety. Without competition, failure lost its teeth. Mistakes became neutral data. Comparison slowly became irrelevant. Social status flattened. Visibility lost power. The phrase best in the world sounded strange. Best at what? For whom? Even nations stopped competing meaningfully. No races, no supremacy narratives, just coexistence. The Olympic ideal transformed. Not faster, higher, stronger, but steadier, cleaner, calmer. Without competition, ego had less to hold on to. Identity softened. People stopped measuring themselves against others. They measured alignment instead. Does this fit? Does this feel right? Some feared complacency. They predicted decline, but decline requires imbalance, and balance held. Children grew without the reflex to compare. They noticed differences without hierarchy. Art changed tone again. No triumphs, no defeats, just coexistence of styles. Criticism softened. There was no ladder to push others off. The idea of proving yourself vanished. There was nothing to prove. Existence was already accepted. Competition had once given life drama. But drama is exhausting. In its absence, life did not become dull. It became breathable. Energy once spent on winning returned to sensing. People felt lighter, not euphoric, stable. Competition did not end with a declaration. It simply failed to justify itself. One day people noticed they hadn't compared themselves to anyone in years, and nothing bad had happened. The world had not collapsed without winners. It had evened out. And in that evenness, something unexpected emerged. Trust. Not trust earned by dominance. trust grown from absence of threat. Competition had been a language of fear. When fear softened, the language fell silent. The world kept going, just see-through. Competition was once described as natural, as if it emerged from the soil, as if it were written into muscle and bone. But competition was never natural. It was contextual. It appeared when resources felt limited, when survival depended on comparison, when one person's gain implied another's loss. Competition was fear given structure. For a long time it worked. It drove efficiency, sharpened skill, accelerated outcomes. Societies organized themselves around it. Schools ranked, markets competed, nations compared. Winning became identity, losing became shame. But in the after, competition lost its terrain, not because rules changed, but because stakes dissolved. When basic needs stabilized, winning stopped mattering. You could still win, it just didn't do anything. The first institutions to feel this were schools. Grades still existed, but they didn't open doors anymore. Doors were already open. Students noticed. They studied differently, not to outperform, to understand. Tests became diagnostic, not judgmental. Sports changed next. Games continued. But records stopped being worshipped. A new record felt like a statistic, not a victory. Crowds still gathered, but they watched differently, not waiting for dominance, enjoying motion. Athletes played longer, not to peak, to remain. Markets followed. Companies competed less aggressively. Innovation no longer promised conquest. Market share stopped feeling heroic. Advertising softened. It stopped shouting. There was no one to defeat. Workplaces lost internal rivalry. Performance reviews became conversations. Collaboration replaced ranking. People noticed their bodies responding. Less tension, less comparison-driven anxiety. Without competition, failure lost its teeth. Mistakes became neutral data. Comparison slowly became irrelevant. Social status flattened. Visibility lost power. The phrase best in the world sounded strange. Best at what? For whom? Even nations stopped competing meaningfully. No races, no supremacy narratives, just coexistence. The Olympic ideal transformed, not faster, higher, stronger, but steadier, cleaner, calmer, without competition. Ego had less to hold on to. Identity softened. People stopped measuring themselves against others. They measured alignment instead. Does this fit? Does this feel right? Some feared complacency. They predicted decline. But decline requires imbalance, and balance held. Children grew without the reflex to compare. They noticed differences without hierarchy. Art changed tone again. No triumphs, no defeats, just coexistence of styles. Criticism softened. There was no ladder to push others off. The idea of proving yourself vanished. There was nothing to prove. Existence was already accepted. Competition had once given life drama, but drama is exhausting in its absence. Life did not become dull, it became breathable. Energy once spent on winning returned to sensing. People felt lighter, not euphoric, stable. Competition did not end with a declaration, it simply failed to justify itself. One day people noticed. They hadn't compared themselves to anyone in years, and nothing bad had happened. The world had not collapsed without winners. It had evened out, and in that evenness, something unexpected emerged. Trust. Not trust earned by dominance. Trust grown from absence of threat. Competition had been a language of fear. When fear softened, the language fell silent. For as long as humans could speak, they asked why the sky moved. why death arrived, why suffering existed, why they themselves were here. The question was older than language, older than memory. It was the engine behind myth, behind science, behind religion, behind rebellion. Why created motion. To ask why was to resist acceptance. It implied that the world owed an explanation. Entire civilizations formed around answers. Some said the answer was gods, some said fate, some said chance, some said equations. The answers disagreed, but the question remained sacred. In the after, the answers did not improve. The question weakened. At first, people still asked why out of habit, why this system existed, why this routine continued, why life felt so even. But the answers arrived too easily. There was no mystery hiding behind them. Why are things this way? Because they work. This answer appeared everywhere. It was unsatisfying, but it was sufficient. Why lost its sharpness? It no longer opened doors, it closed conversations. Science noticed first. Research had always been driven by curiosity, but curiosity depends on friction, and friction was gone. Most questions led to refinement, not revelation. Understanding deepened, but meaning did not expand. Philosophy followed. Old questions were revisited: existence, consciousness, purpose. But nothing felt urgent. Debate softened into reflection. Students listened politely. They understood the problems. They just didn't feel pulled by them. Religion adapted again. Faith shifted away from explanation. It became practice, ritual without justification, presence without doctrine. Why had always been fueled by suffering. When suffering stabilized, why became optional. People noticed they were living full days without asking a single existential question, and nothing collapsed. Morning routines unfolded calmly. People woke, they ate, they worked, they rested. No invisible interrogation followed them. The mind grew quieter, not dull, spacious. Children stopped asking why endlessly, not because they were discouraged, because answers satisfied them quickly. Parents noticed something strange. Children asked how instead, how things fit, how things feel, how to care. Why had demanded justification, how invited participation. Art reflected the shift again. No metaphors reaching upward, no symbolism straining toward meaning, just depiction. What is seen, what is felt. Stories stopped explaining themselves, they existed. People stopped asking, what is the meaning of life? The question felt too large, too abstract, like asking the meaning of breathing. Meaning had always been something extracted. Now it was something experienced. Without why, guilt softened. People no longer demanded reasons for their existence. They simply allowed it. Death approached differently too. Why did this happen? The question still appeared, but briefly, then faded. Grief remained, but existential anger did not. The universe no longer felt like a riddle, it felt like a space. Some intellectuals resisted fiercely. They warned that without why, humanity would lose depth, lose aspiration, lose soul. But humanity did not feel shallower, it felt settled. Why had been a restless question, it never slept. Its absence allowed rest. People did not stop thinking. They stopped interrogating existence. Silence filled the gap. Not ignorance, acceptance. The mind learned to stay where it was. When why finally loosened its grip, nothing rushed in to replace it. No new ultimate question, no final answer, just life, continuing without explanation. And for the first time, That felt complete. The world kept going, just see-through. Stillness was never humanity's goal. If anything, it was something to be avoided. Stillness meant danger, stagnation, death. To be still was to fall behind a moving world. For thousands of years, motion was proof of life, growth, expansion, change. Stillness was what happened after everything else failed, but in the after, that meaning inverted. Stillness did not arrive as surrender, it arrived as arrival. There was no moment when humanity decided to stop. No announcement, no philosophy, no final invention. People simply noticed they were no longer being pulled. Nothing ahead demanded them, nothing behind chased them. Movement continued, but without urgency. People walked, worked, spoke, but beneath all of it was a deep, unmoving layer. Like the ocean below waves, stillness did not remove activity. It removed pressure. Time stopped feeling sharp. Minutes no longer cut into each other. Hours expanded gently. Days became spaces, not containers. People noticed they could sit without distraction, not because they tried, because nothing interrupted them from inside. Thoughts slowed, not fewer, softer. They drifted instead of collided. Silence changed quality. It was no longer empty, it was textured. Rooms felt fuller, with less happening in them. Nature mirrored this state. Forests grew without urgency. Rivers flowed without erosion. Animals moved without fear. Cities adapted quietly. Less noise, less light. Not dim, calm. Architecture stopped trying to impress. Buildings rested in place. They did not point upward. They settled. Art reached its final transformation. No message, no rebellion, no statement. Just form, just presence. Music stretched into near stillness. Long tones, spaces between notes. Silence became part of composition. Listeners did not wait for resolution. They stayed where they were. Even language thinned. Fewer words were needed. Pauses became meaningful. Conversation slowed. Listening deepened. People realized something unexpected. Stillness was not passive. It was attentive. To be still was to notice. Breath, light, temperature. The subtle continuity of being alive. Achievement had once meant change. Now it meant alignment. A good life was not one that moved far. It was one that fit well. Death, when it came, felt less like interruption, more like release back into stillness. Grief existed, but it was quiet, not torn. Memory softened. The past did not haunt, it rested. Future lost its grip. Plans existed, but lightly. The present expanded until it felt sufficient. Humanity did not transcend, did not evolve into something else, did not escape the body. It simply stopped straining against itself. Stillness became the background of everything, not boredom, not emptiness, a gentle, continuous enough. If someone from the before had looked at this world, they might have asked, "What happened? Why did you stop?" But no one in the after would know how to answer, because nothing ended. There was no peak, no final lesson, no conclusion, just a world that learned it did not need to become more to remain whole. And so humanity stayed, breathing, listening, present, not waiting for anything, not afraid of stillness anymore. Because stillness was not the absence of life, it was life no longer being interrupted,